morning, everybody. Good morning and welcome. Welcome to our panelists, the members of the Mideast Institute, the press, the students, government officials, guests. We're delighted to have you here today. Welcome to the opening of the Mideast Institute's 66th annual conference, 66 of them. I think that you will find, I hope you'll be able to stay the entire day, I think you'll find all of the panels that our wonderful Vice President Kate Seeley has organized to be engaging as they analyze the really the momentous events that have occurred throughout this year. And some of these events have been troubling, some of them have been encouraging. But as we look forward to this coming year, it's going to be very challenging for the United States and for the people of the Middle East. Now, so today, after the presidential elections are very happily behind us, we have an opportunity to pause and evaluate, look back over the events of the Middle East this past year with a renewed focus. President Obama will essentially have a new national security team, and they will face a Middle East that is more complicated and more delicate for U.S. policymakers than, if you can believe it, any time in the past, but also more complicated and delicate for the people of the Middle East themselves. The panels today will look at these challenges to U.S. policy. The first one most specifically, but then the following panels will look at Egypt, we'll look at Iran, and we'll look at Syria. Clearly, Washington needs to understand what is happening in the Middle East, the trends and the turmoil, and we don't really. We need to spend more time really focusing on these issues. That's what the Mideast Institute is all about. After all, that's our mission. To educate and to inform and to analyze the events in the Middle East for the American public and beyond. And it is in that spirit, our mission, to inform and educate, that we make this conference entirely free for all of you wonderful participants who've come to join us today. We open it to the public. We open it free of charge, although it costs us to you. So I hope you will enjoy and find value in the conference today, and will be moved to join us as a member. We're a membership organization, and we do rely upon our membership dues to be able to sponsor events like this. There's a table outside in the foyer. A $100 a year membership gets you a number of perks. The one that I always like the best is 4 editions of the Middle East Journal, a peer-reviewed academic journal that is very, very interesting. So please, I encourage you to join us as a member. Our moderator today, Ambassador Deborah Jones, who is currently on a year sabbatical from the State Department with the Middle East Journal, is stuck in traffic. And so I'd like to invite our amazing Vice President for Programs, who's really put together this whole day program, to join us on the podium and to pitch hitter as the moderator for the first panel. Kate?
Good morning and welcome. Today's panel is entitled U.S. Mideast Diplomacy in Transition, New Era, New Principles. I have not written sort of framing remarks, but the thinking was simply that in this time of extreme change and transition, some would say revolution in the Middle East, what should U.S. foreign policymakers be thinking in terms of strategies, approaches, doctrines toward a region in shift that can ensure a stable, secure, or promote, I should say, a stable, secure, prosperous region and ensure U.S. interests. Well, to discuss this issue, we have assembled a wonderful panel of experts, and I will introduce them briefly here. Their full bios are in your program books. So without further ado, we're going to begin with Mr. Lawrence Korb, who's filling in for Mr. Colin Kahl, who had to cancel for personal reasons. And Mr. Korb is a senior fellow at the Center for American Progress. He's a senior advisor to the Center for Defense Information and an adjunct professor at Georgetown University. Prior to joining the Center for American Progress, he was a senior fellow and director of national security studies at the Council on Foreign Relations. He will be followed by Ellen Laipson. Ellen is the president and chief executive officer of the Stimson Center. Prior, Ms. Laipson was vice chair of the National Intelligence Council and special assistant to the U.S. Permanent Representative to the United Nations. Laipson's earlier government career focused on analysis and policymaking on Middle East and South Asian issues. She will be followed by Mr. Daniel Brumberg, who is a senior advisor to the Center for Conflict Analysis and Prevention at the United States Institute of Peace, where he focuses on issues of democratization and political reform in the Middle East and Islamic world. He's also an associate professor at Georgetown University and a former senior associate in the Carnegie Endowment's Democracy and Rule of Law project, and will be concluding with Mr. Reuel Marc Gerecht, a senior fellow with the Foundation for Defense of Democracies. He focuses on Iran, Iraq, Afghanistan, terrorism, and intelligence. He's the author of The Wave, Man, God, and the Ballot Box in the Middle East, and the Islamic Paradox, Shiite Clerics, Sunni Fundamentalists, and the Coming of Arab Democracies. I want to thank you all so much for joining us today. It is such an honor and a treat, and I would like to invite Mr. Korb to the podium to begin the panel.
Thank you very much. It's a great pleasure to be here. When you're trying to think about, what's happening in the Near East, the Greater Middle East, or whatever, however you want to describe it, it's almost impossible to predict, what happened. And obviously, some good things could happen and some bad things. And in preparing my remarks today, I'm reminded of a story I heard back in 2010 when I made a trip to Israel. And it seems that the story that I was told was that this elderly couple, before they passed on, decided they wanted to go to the Holy Land. So they went over there, and unfortunately, while they were there, the man did pass away. And so the rabbi came to the widow and said, I'm really sorry for your loss. You have a decision to make. And she said, well, what's that? He said, would you like to have your husband buried here, or do you want to take him back home? And she thought for a couple of seconds. She said, well, how much would it cost to have him buried here? The rabbi said, I don't know, $50, $100. She said, what about if I take him home? He said, oh, that'll be several thousand. She thought for a couple of seconds. She said, I want to take him back home. The rabbi said, why? $50, $100, several thousand? She says, well, I heard that years ago they buried a fella here, and after 3 days he rose again, and I don't want to take a chance. And of course, when you're trying to say, well, I predict this or I predict that, it's very, very, very difficult. Now, as I take a look at the situation, a couple of things, leap out at me. First of all, a lot of what happened in the Arab Spring had nothing to do with the United States. We in the United States, because of our role as a superpower in the Cold War, we basically think everything that happens in the world is about us. It wasn't about us. And I think that's important because people say, well, what are you going to do about it? Well, it really didn't have anything to do with us. It wasn't like the Iranian Revolution, in the late 1970s, where a lot of it had to do with the fact that they were trying to get rid of a person we installed there, the Shah. And so it did have, something to do with us. The next thing to keep in mind is that while the United States is powerful, we're not omnipotent. We can't solve every problem by ourselves, nor do we need to. And again, that's very hard for some people to adjust to, again, given the way the Cold War ended, and we were for, at least a decade, the world's only power with no rivals. And so therefore, when you deal with the things in the situations there, you have to work with other countries. The next thing is, well, we have a very powerful military, probably, in many cases, the most powerful military in the world. You're not going to be able to solve every problem militarily. And then finally, some problems you have to live with. In other words, you have to manage things you can't solve. And again, for Americans, we got a problem, let's solve it, and let's move on. Okay, it doesn't work like that, particularly when you're dealing with this part of the world. Now, having said that, let me get into some of the specifics. Egypt, probably the dominant power there, had an election, and Mr. Morsi won. Well, that was their choice. They voted for him, they elected him, and our challenge now is to work with him in such a way that it furthers our interests and the interests of the other countries in the region, particularly Israel. And so therefore, when I see people say, oh, my goodness, we don't like everything he does, we ought to cut off aid and stuff like that, that'd be cutting off your nose to spite your face. We need to work with him, and I must say I've been pretty pleased with what he's done, coming in and putting the military in this place, going to Tehran and denouncing what the Iranians were doing in Syria. So I think we need to work with them. Now, when it came to Libya, and when you had the horrible things happening there, and the United States worked with other countries to deal with the situations. Now, unfortunately, somebody in the Obama administration used the term leading from behind, and that became a campaign issue, and it became a way for people to say, well, you weren't doing your job. No, that was the way to do it, because basically what happened, the Arab League, NATO, the UN authorized it. We got involved. We provided the unique capabilities that only our military has. And Gaddafi was gone at a cost of no American lives and at about $1 billion. Look at Iraq, over $1 trillion. And what do you got there? I'll tell you, one of the things you got there is a powerful Iran. And so the idea that somehow or another this was, a failure. Now, everybody says, well, yeah, but look what's happened now. Look what happens after every time you have a change of power. Now, we're going to have hearings, on Benghazi this week, and people are going to talk about who knew what when, and all this kind of stuff. And people say, well, this shows that al-Qaeda is back. Let me tell you something. That group that was involved in there has as much connection to al-Qaeda Central as your local BP gas station does to BP headquarters. You want to call yourself Al-Qaeda? You can. Okay, you can call you. Okay, but the idea that somehow this is, okay, they're a group, they're not happy. Is Al-Qaeda happy with the fact that we've been, decimating their leadership, dealing with Al-Qaeda in the Arabian Peninsula? And so people use the term Al-Qaeda to sort of say, well, bin Laden and company are back. No. And so is it unstable? Should the international community get involved? Sure. And then, of course, you get to Syria. Now, I was talking to a former head of the Central Command, whose name I can't use, and he said, if you liked Iraq, you'll love Syria. And in terms of, sending American men and women there to deal with it, and this is obviously, there are things you can do, but you have to balance, if you will, hard power and soft power here. And in terms, I would not suggest us going in unless there's an international movement like you had in Libya, and that doesn't look like it is. But we're doing things. Obviously, we probably have agents on the ground, and I think Secretary Clinton was right to, tell the opposition rather than, the folks living out of the country to get together and form a coherent government. So the idea that somehow or another that if Syria doesn't turn out absolutely the way we would like, that this will be the end of the world. This is not the Cold War where it's a zero-sum game.